Welcome to my train wreck. You know, somehow feel like Bruce Willis in Unbreakable, where he somehow walked away like a superhero from this train wreck, unscathed. Although I know it's only by the grace of God that I walk away as a new creation in Him.
My name's Steve Vaughan. 44 years old. As far as I know, white American male. Live in Pataska. I lived in Central Ohio all of my life, although I've tried to get out of here many times. I'm a worshiper at heart. I've done my best to try to run away from that in my life. I had a Pastor Steve Buellin, that said something to me that reverberated with me, and I thought about it this week, that when you're running away from God, it's like running on an oval track, and eventually you find yourself back where you originally ran away from Him. And I think I've seen that this week, and just kind of thinking things over. When I first started using alcohol, I was 20 years old. Or I think they're called a growler, the big bottle with the little finger hold in the top of it. I think that's what it's called. Anyway, I was working at a tanning salon, and I remember one of my customers must have worked at some brewery, and she brought one of those into me. And I mean, this is when I started. I kept the thing under the edge of my bed. I'd get it out and take drinks every once in a while. I mean, growing up, I remember Dad have friends over, and he'd have a beer, and I'd take a sip here or there. But I never really drank growing up. I was a pretty good kid. I was involved in the youth group at the church that my mom went to after my parents got divorced. And I mean, in my mind, I was going to save myself sexually until I married the one, and I didn't have any plans on any of my life derailing, whether it was from drugs or alcohol. So, a year before I was legally allowed, I started drinking. I remember around 93, 94 is when things ramped up a little bit. It's probably about that same time. Miller Genuine Draft was my preferred drink, which I absolutely hate now, ironically. And usually just did shots of Jack. But that never really grabbed me. That was just something I did. I didn't even really do it to have a good time. It was almost like that's kind of what you did at that age. You drank. When I was 21, I remember my best friend at the time, he and his buddy climbed in the back of the car I had, which was my mom's car. Sorry, Mom. And they had some pot, and they said, "What, do you want us to get out of the car?" And no, you can smoke in there. "Well, you don't mind? You don't smoke, do you?" "No, I'll be fine." And I remember getting my first contact buzz, and shortly after, maybe the summer that year, first time I smoked marijuana, I remember it being out of little graphics bong that was being used to smoke opium out of. So that was my introduction. I remember seeing paisley designs after the fact that I thought were turkeys dancing on the tapestry. So I'm going to say it was probably around, 94 was when I really started getting into smoking pot regularly. By 96, I was in a band that was doing pretty good, pretty successful. We were really making waves. I mean, it was a time when I was at least carrying a quarter bag of pot in my pocket, if not having a duffel bag full of paraphernalia. It was around that time when my band started recording. We did a full album at John Schwab Studios. I remember, just doing bong hits in the studio and not having anybody question us. It was getting out of control. I mean, in retrospect, back then, you have no idea what you're doing when you're doing it. I started going over to our friend's house where we rehearsed. I'd go over in the afternoon as soon as I got off work because we would smoke pot. And I mean, he was rolling big ones. There'd be 10 or 20 of us sitting around the living room, and by the time the first one came around to you, he'd already rolled a second one, and it was right behind. And those were just rotating around the room. Or he had a 6-foot bong, and you were expected to clear it. If you didn't clear it, you started over and you did another one. And so pot quickly became my drug of choice. But like I said, I would go over for an afternoon. I remember one afternoon I was over there and I see these boxes of CO2 cartridges. And I'm, well, what are those? Well, they're whippets. Well, what do you do with those? Well, they're for tonight, but here, let's try one. And next thing I know, we had no whippets for the rest of the night. My buddy and I sat there and did every single one he had laid out for the party together. Thinking back, that's when things started getting out of control. I tried opium again several years later, or a couple years later. And I mean, it just didn't feel any different to me because my introduction to all of that was out of a bong that people smoked opium out of. So it just sort of all felt like home. I remember desiring to do heroin because I was told that's the best. That's the one you want. If you want to get high, that's where you want to go. And for the life of me, I could never find it. I didn't know who to ask. I was afraid to ask because you might get in trouble. I never found it. So I kept messing around with that kind of stuff. Years and years after all of the band stuff, I tried cocaine one night, and it did absolutely nothing for me, which I consider a complete blessing. I did it one night, and that was the end of it. About the time I really stopped using drugs the first time was the time ecstasy was coming on the scene. And in '95, in the midst of me starting to use marijuana, I had my first kidney stone. Around that time, I was drinking probably 12 cans of Mountain Dew a day, really, on average. And it caught up with me. And they tried Darvocet, and I had hellacious nightmares and told the doctor, there's no way, I can't take Darvocet. And he said, well, here's some Percocet. And I had Percocet around through 2016. At first, it was because I had legitimate kidney pain. And until 2004, when I had a back injury that sidelined me, I couldn't even roll out of bed. And doctor tried me on 3 or 4 different painkillers and finally came back to my alma mater, and there was Percocet again. And it escalated to the point where I was doing 6 to 8 Percocet a day. And I talked to a buddy, and he said, well, you ought to do a tumbler of Steel Reserve with it to wash it down. So I started doing that. And I was getting back into smoking pot around that time, so I'd roll a joint, and I'd have about a third of the joint, 2 Percocet, and a tumbler of Steel Reserve. I did that for just under 2 years, every day. Wasn't at work. That's all I did. And that was 2004 when I was injured, so It wasn't until 2016, so it was 12 solid years of Percocet. Prior to my back injury in 2004, I'd gotten married. I went on my first date with she's my ex-wife now, and I decided that I didn't want to smoke pot. I decided I wanted to see what it was like to be with this girl. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that I didn't need marijuana to be happy. So this was like 98. So I had a stretch of time where I wasn't smoking. Like I said, in 2004, I injured my back and started taking Percocet regularly, daily, heavily. But there was a period of time between 98 and probably about 2001 where I wasn't smoking marijuana. I ended up coming back to that as a supplement. So my first few years of marriage were great. We were going to the church. We were heavily involved. I was part of the worship team. It was a small church. We had a rented facility. So every week I would wake up early. I'd load my drums into my truck. We would drive to church. I'd unload my drums, set them up. My mother-in-law was on the worship team. It was a very family environment. When we got done, I packed everything up, loaded it back in my truck, went home, unloaded it back into the house. It was a lot of work, but it just was what it was. That's what we did. So when I injured my back, and I guess you could say I was reunited with Percocet and then eventually reunited with marijuana, I had legitimate back pain, and I'd never considered myself addictive personality, ever. I just wasn't that type. I didn't understand people that were addicted to cigarettes. I had, in fact, tried to smoke, tried to make it a habit, and never could. So I'm married, things are going well, I'm on the worship team, I get injured, I'm out of work. And we figure finances out a bit, and I'm off work using drugs, but I've got it under control. And through that process, we buy a house, and I've got it under control. At this point, I'm back to a job, although a different field. So I went from doing construction to working for a big bank in Columbus. Did some time there and sat and ate Percocet at my desk every day. Had the bottle sitting out on my desk. Supervisors knew. And eventually I had a friend of mine that's since passed away come up to me one day to fix my computer and saw my bottle sitting there and got to talking to me. And he'd fallen, I believe it was like 20 feet. He was in the military and injured his back. And, man, you think I could get some of those from you? Yeah, sure. I mean, I had them in abundance. I didn't think anything of it. Then eventually, hey, you think I can get some more? I'll pay for them. Yeah, sure. I don't know what to charge. And in a short time, I was taking home $400 a month and still had plenty for myself. Did that for years. So I remember playing with the band, and I'm still taking Percocet. I'm still drinking. I was drinking Heineken Light. That was my favorite beer at the time, and still smoking pot. And I remember playing drums one-handed and drinking out of my bottle of wine. Still playing one-handed, handing it over to the bass player, and him taking swigs, fretting it one-handed, and then we just keep the groove going. I mean, all of that was just something that we did. But just to think that it was in such abundance, it was there, it was all the time. Coming home from work and cracking a bottle in the hot shower and setting it up on the back of the shower, taking my shower, that was part of my routine every day. Cold beer and a hot shower. Every day. I never felt like it was a problem. I was Steve Vaughan. I can't say that everybody likes me, but I've always felt like I'm a well-liked individual. I mean, when I was playing in bands, I had people coming up to me all the time. When I was playing in the bands, I didn't pay for drugs. They were given to us. Pot, alcohol. Like I said, I never got into cocaine or ecstasy, but the other people in the house where we rehearsed were into cocaine. I remember smoking my pot, drinking my alcohol, passing out, and waking up about 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning and seeing people walking around the house, swallowing hard, cleaning the house, and just wondering what in the heck's their deal. It just never appealed to me. So the people that I was around didn't question what I was doing because I was just doing the top surface. I wasn't digging deep into the harder stuff. It was my wife during my first marriage, if anybody, that really questioned it. She saw what was going on, but she never ratted me out. She came and questioned me a couple times, like, hey, what are you doing? She hung out with me a couple times while I was smoking pot in the garage. But she never came at me like, hey, this has got to stop. This is wrong. You can't be doing this. It wasn't until she told me that she wanted a divorce that really kind of made me take a step back and wonder what the heck was going on. But that wasn't until after I got through a bout of depression, thinking about suicide and planning out in my head how I was going to kill myself, thinking I can put a bullet through my head and have her walk through and see me holding a gun and the floor covered in blood, and that'll get her. I had hit rock bottom, or so I thought, but I mean, there was a long road ahead and a lot more pieces to the puzzle before I finally got there. Later, I got into a spot during my divorce where I had realized that she wasn't coming back, because when she first left, she told me, well, I'm just going to move out. We're going to work on things. My pastor suggested that I have 2 of my best friends help her move her belongings out. Well, some of those belongings were my personal things, so I was advised that I needed to leave the house while my best friends moved half of my personal things into her new place, which turned out to be a mile up the road. So I did what I thought every good man should do and tried to pay on the house on my own for 17 months. During that time, I moved roommates in and roommates moved in, moved out. Kept drinking, or came back to drinking. I think I had a small moment where I stopped. And I mean a small moment. Got back into smoking. I had never stopped taking Percocet because I still had back pain. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that the aches and pains that you feel from those narcotics are actually part of the withdrawal, that you've got to keep escalating it or those withdrawals keep jumping at you. So I felt legitimate pain, but it was from the addiction. And of course, I wasn't an addictive personality, so I wasn't addicted. So had roommates in, and it'd been a while since I'd been with my wife, and I decided that I was lonely. And one of my roommates was a female, and asked her if she had any friends. And next thing I know, I'm spending time with who's now my 7-year-old daughter's mom. She was pregnant within a month. And of course, the right thing to do is to move her in. I'm going to take care of my girlfriend, take care of the baby. And that's when her personality came out, and I realized that things weren't quite what I had thought. I realized that the tattoos and the bleached blonde hair and the cool rocker chick It just wasn't what I originally thought, that there was more to the puzzle, that those few moments in bed didn't give me a full view, a full scope of who this person was. So that's when I decided I was going to go for custody of her. And as part of that process, I was told that if I had any drugs in my system in the past 8 years, I had to get my hair cut. I had been growing my hair out for 20 years at that point. I had hair down to my waist, beard down to here. So I bit the bullet after 6 months of fighting it, cut it all off, which was just a blow to me. I mean, here I'm losing my identity. I mean, that's who I was, you know. All the musicians that I'd looked up to, I had the look. Finally, after all these years, I was confused for Rob Zombie. I was confused for Zakk Wylde, Max Cavalera from Sepultura. People came up to me and, are you him? There's a band in Athens, Skeleton Witch. I remember a guy would not leave me alone, swore that I was a singer from Skeleton Witch. No, I don't know who you're talking about, buddy. So, you know, I had the look, and all of a sudden it's gone, and I'm confiding in my best friend. And my attorney's saying we're going for a drug test, and I cut off my hair right before. We go in for a drug test because now all that hair's gone, so when they test, they've got clean hair. And my daughter's mom tests clean, knowing that she was snorting Percocet and smoking pot, among other things. There was no way she could have tested clean. That's when I find out my best friend was sleeping with my daughter's mom, right in the midst of everything. And it blows my mind to think that you just keep hitting layer after layer and you haven't hit rock bottom yet. When I hear of people now, while they're at rock bottom, you just wonder, well, is there another layer? Are they done? Are they really there yet? Because it took a while for me to get to that point and realize that I had a ways to go. And honestly, it's not until looking back and thinking through all of this to realize that it was such a long way to go until I finally got to that point. This week, as I was thinking about my story, thinking about my testimony, where I've come from, where I've been, I remember being in the midst of all of this mess. I remember meeting with a man. His name was Rich Fout, good friend of mine. And I remember him explaining Christ's love to me. And in the midst of this, I remember seeing my daughter once she was born. And she was going out of town at 3 months on an airplane with her mom. They were going out of state for a wedding, and it just ripped me apart. I was thinking, my daughter's mom's using drugs, you know, because of course at this point, I'm just using prescription drugs. That's okay. I'm not smoking pot anymore. I cut my hair off. I tested clean. You know, I might still drink, but, you know, it's just after work. I'm not drinking at work. I'm not drinking for breakfast. So I'm so concerned about my daughter, and I'm broken, and I'm still in church dealing with my prescription substance abuse. And remember Rich telling me that as much as you are concerned and you care about your daughter and you're worried about her welfare while she's out of town, just think about how much your Father in heaven cares about you, how much more concern and care he has for you. And I knew that the feeling that I had, the overwhelming, what am I going to do? How do I know my daughter's going to be safe? I knew that there was no way to reconcile that in myself. That there was no answer for me. And it grieved me more than anything to think that I had grieved my Heavenly Father for all this time, all the drugs, all the drinking. You know, I hadn't even touched on all the sex and garbage I got into there. An abortion years ago, even though I was raised not to do anything like that, but agreed with an ex-girlfriend that, sure, I'll help pay. Her resurfacing years later and asking if she can meet my daughter. Just the mess that gives you in your head. So it was seeing this daughter during this process of getting my hair cut, going for custody, only taking prescription drugs because I'm okay, that I had to have my blood tested, and while my daughter was in my possession at 3 months, take her in and have her blood tested. Because in Ohio, you have no rights to your child unless you're married. She was completely her mother's. This is what I was told. So in order for me to have custody of my kid, first I had to prove that she was mine. So enter the DNA test. So then there was this wonderful 2 weeks of chaos in my life because of the decisions I'd made to have sex outside of marriage with someone that I was partying. I mean, she smoked pot the entire pregnancy. So then I'm wondering, how's this going to affect my kid? So for 2 weeks, when I had my child, I'm holding her, just feeling this disconnect, like, well, I don't know if you're mine. And I remember that being the most horrible feeling, where I didn't want to take care of this kid who I had just been taking care of a week before. And then finally, when that paper came back, it was the weirdest feeling to have to reconnect with this child that 2 weeks before, this is mine, I love her to death. But I had disconnected myself and had to reconnect myself. All that turmoil that had come out of my wasteland of a life that I'd created. I was doing everything I could to keep that house going for my ex-wife still at this time. And then when I finally told her, hey, I can't keep up on the house on my own anymore, even though I'd had roommates, it really didn't matter. And within a week, I had divorce papers on my front door. So now I've got my baby. I'm going for custody. Got a divorce. It's all happening at the same time. I mean, my life was a wreck. See, I was involved with the church through all of this mess, through my divorce. And then when I felt like I had to migrate out of that church, I found another church. I had a desire to do things of God, but I still wanted my foot in the game. I still wanted to play. I still wanted to play in bands. I still wanted to drink. I still wanted to do all those things. I still had my legitimate pain, and I had a legitimate prescription, so I had a real reason to use prescription drugs, narcotics, and it wasn't illegal. I was cool. So although I'd been in the church the majority of my life, although I knew the truth, I can think back to when I was first introduced to Nine Inch Nails, and they were one of my favorite bands. I still love their music, not their message so much. But I remember his lyrics that would say, God is dead and no one cares. If there's a hell, I'll see you there. And I had adopted that when I fell away from the church, which was around in 92. I had about 8 years where I was off or away from the church, and I had not come back until around 2000. Other than that period, I was in the church. I was involved in my church. I was part of my church. I was just living two lives. Although I desired the things of God, I also desired the things of the world, and I couldn't choose one. It took even more for me to get to that place. And I mean, it took God. It took God coming in after prayer, after people laying hands on me and believing for wholeness and wellness in me, and accepting, yes, I have that, but not feeling the evidence because of my addiction, and me, after my divorce, getting remarried and finding out my wife was having twins. It took me realizing that after all the other consequences I'd had in my life, that gaining a belly on myself and not being able to keep up with my kids in the yard wasn't the person I wanted to be. That I had to get off of the Percocet. I had to finish this. my healing was already there. I believe that God takes care of that. In fact, I believe he took care of that on the cross. I believe we have that wholeness. But I still had to step out of that mess of addiction. And it wasn't until a few years later, around 2012, when a couple years before that, around 2010, when I started talking to some other doctors besides my doctor that kept prescribing them to me month after month. And I found a doctor that suggested I start snapping those pills in half rather than taking a whole, because I couldn't get over that hurdle on my own. I couldn't do it. As much as I was just able to stop marijuana cold turkey, or not drink if I didn't want to drink, or have a drink 1 week and it could be months before I had another, and I couldn't tell you the last day I drank, because that was not really my bane. I couldn't get over this hurdle, and that's when I realized when my prescription would dry up and I'd have to wait a couple days until it came in, and I was sweating and cramping and felt like I had to have a full body massage to get the pain out. And then as soon as the massage was over, it just kept going. The pain didn't stop. That's when I finally realized I might not be mentally addicted, but my body is physically addicted, and I can't get out of this. My journey out of that, although walking through making the decision to break those in half and walk that out, I have talked to so many people, doctors included, that are blown away that I was able to stop a 12-year addiction like that. And it's not humanly possible. It takes God to come in and intervene and put his hand on you. Besides your willingness, your heart. Like I said, I always had a foot in the church, but a foot in the world to play games. They just don't mix. You know, I guess I've got to call it a blessing that a lot of the friends that I had the whole way, I'd shared Christian metal. That was something that I'd been into, Christian metal music. And I'd shared it with them since, I don't know, 92, 94, when I first started getting into that kind of stuff. And they realized that it was legitimate music. So I kind of had that foot in the door, that when I came out of this mess, they were right there with me. Man, I'm happy for you, bro. That's good. Unfortunately, some of them still use. But one of my friends served in the church with us. So I really didn't have a lot of blowback. I posted this week on Facebook and asked for prayer, and had a conversation with my mom this week, preceding coming in and giving my testimony. And she made comment, I don't know if it was on Facebook or in our conversation or both, but she said, you know, Steve, I'm proud of you. And I don't know if you realize, but God has always been there for you. He's always taken care of you. And it reminds me of the story of Jonah, when he was doing everything he could to run away from God. And I believe God wasn't going to have any of it. You know, the people on the ship didn't want him there. We don't want anything to do with you. They throw him off. Story goes that a whale came and swallowed him up. And it took that moment in the midst of his mess, in his rock bottom, where he had to step back and say, okay, fine, I'll go to this place that I don't have any interest to go. Whether it's putting out a testimony and being afraid of what your friends are going to say, or going into the grocery store and just preaching the gospel, whatever that situation is, to just finally stepping up to the plate and saying, God, I'm going to do what you want. And I believe that's what happened. Was I was in the midst of this mess, just like Jonah, and God had his hand on him and said, no, I've got something I need for you to do for me. I feel deep inside that there's no one that can reach the people that I know the way that I can reach them, because of the relationships I have cultivated, genuine relationships. Nothing, there's been no pre-planned agenda to say, I'm going to go find Stan and go talk to Stan, and let me go through this mess and then come around the back door and talk to him. I went through my mess because I walked that out. Had nothing to do with anything that I was planning down in my future. I wasn't planning. That was probably part of the problem, although God needs to make those plans. And I believe that he ultimately knew what was going on and had his hand on me. And I believe that has, to use a term, I believe that has been my saving grace. Christ has been my saving grace through this. Without him having his hand on me, I could have been dead. In fact, it got to the point where in the midst of all that mess, see, everything happened for me. It started when I had kidney stones in 95, when I first started all this Percocet mess. And finally, I believe it was 2008, after 15 years of kidney stones twice a year, which ultimately means 4 surgeries a year for 15 years, because I'd have a surgery for a lithotripsy and they'd place a stent, and I'd have to wait a week, 2 weeks, and then I'd have another surgery for them to take the stent out. So that was 2 surgeries for 1 kidney stone. And I had another 2 surgeries the next 6 months, and that went on for 15 years until finally I lost use of my right kidney. And when I was going through that, it was during my first marriage. I remember my wife in there hysterically calling the nurse over and saying, "You got to give him something for the pain." And them saying, "We can't give him any more." And she came over to me and she said, "Do you want more? Because I feel like we've given you a lot." And I looked at her and said, "Ma'am, I feel like if you give me any more, I'm going to stop breathing." I had ramped myself so high up on Percocets over the years that there was nothing else they could do. There was no place for me to go. It was take more and stop breathing, as evidenced by someone in the medical field, a professional, or I could continue down my path. Unfortunately, I continued down my path. I had my kidney removed. But at the tail end of this, in hindsight, that was God's provision, God's hand of grace over my life. I'm not done with you. There's a verse in Scripture that talks about he knows who we are when we're in the womb. And I believe that. I believe that for everyone. I believe that he knew who I was going to be. He knew the garbage that I would put myself through. But I believe that it's a moment like today that will turn my mess into glory for his kingdom. That there will be somebody that has been through some of this mess, that maybe has the same profession, that had the same desires in life, and they're going to connect, and they're going to want to speak with somebody that maybe understands them. And that's my prayer. Man, my life now is awesome. I'm free from addiction of painkillers. I mean, I will still have back pain from time to time, and praise God, I've got a wife that begrudgingly rubs my back when it hurts, because I know it's an easy thing to do, to take Percocet to get my pain to go away. It's not something I do anymore. I know that that's not where I want to be. I don't believe that everybody can just say, well, I'm not going to do it. I believe, again, that's God's grace. That's God's hand on my life. I believe it might take many years for me to see the full picture, because I believe you can't know where the book leads until you read the final chapter. But there's a reason that I'm still here. There's a reason that I'm not dealing with the addiction to pain meds. My desire to get off pain meds was because I want to be clear-headed. I want to be able to run and play with my children. I want to be able to know my limits and work through those physically. It's still a process, but I've got a set of boy-girl twins that'll be 5 in June. I've got a daughter that's 7, another daughter that's going to be 17 in a month, and I want to be able to do things with them. I've got a beautiful wife that loves me, that's supportive, that allows me to get out of the house and take time to give my testimony, that suffers long when I have rehearsals for worship practice on Thursday nights. Continues to take care of the kids when I'm asked to play the following Sunday, and then we find out that the drummer for the third week in a row can't be there, and I get asked to play 3 weeks in a row. I'm a blessed man. I've got a job that, although I'm not raking in millions of dollars, allows us to have a wonderful lifestyle. I've got a wife that's supportive of me remodeling a third of our basement for a rehearsal space and a recording space. My desire for that space moving forward is to be able to have an atmosphere of worship constantly, but still be able to have my friends from my bands come in and have them sense something different in that space. One of the first things you see when you come in is this picture that my uncle had of Christ, and it's kind of funny because a lot of the things I like kind of gravitate around dark images, and it's a picture of Christ. I see it and I think it is awesome, but at the same point it's kind of haunting, and my wife is kind of sensitive to that, like, oh, I don't really like it, but it just speaks to me, and I believe that's one of those things that's going to speak to a lot of my musician friends when they walk in. You know, that's awesome, man. And I want that to be a place where they feel welcomed, where I can hang up a Megadeth poster on one side and have a poster of Christ here, that they just don't feel so invaded, but that they can feel a peace that passes all understanding in that room, that they don't have to understand where it comes from, but feel welcome, and that they will come back. For me, it's about having those moments with people, actually connecting with people, hearing their story. That's something our Pastor Simon, talked about. He started Ubering, and he would come in on Sundays and tell us stories about some girl crying hysterically because this guy left her at the bar and now he's driving her home drunk. He's Ubering and he's praying for this girl in the backseat of his car the whole time. And that's what it's about for me. It's about Christ going out when everybody says, well, you shouldn't be associating with a prostitute. And by no means am I condoning going to places like that. But, you know, you go and maybe sit up at the bar at Applebee's and you're having your dinner. And the person that comes beside you, maybe they look a little different. Maybe they have tattoos. Maybe they reek of the night before. And connecting with the undesirable people, the people that the suits and ties don't want anything to do with. That's what it's about for me, is being Christ to those people.